that's a really great
music at dance halls.
And I don't mean to cut you
People
off,
just don't do it.
What I wanted to ask you guys, that just kind of springs into this next question, especially with David and Jim's research of these musicians, like, for example, Big Road Blues. You know, David's going into the Delta, he's finding these musicians who would otherwise be unknown. And so one of the questions that I would like to pose is thinking about the institution and thinking about the academy. As we start documenting things, you know, academicians are thinking about the discourse being controlled by letters and by words. And so when the story is being told outside of the actual place that it's being told from, you know, sometimes people get a bad rep. And sometimes it's also hard for the people researching it. I want to know from you all's perspective, having gone into these situations and trying to highlight a passion, how does that feel for you? Like, how does that resonate as far as being questioned about laying down a history, an oral tradition that is otherwise unknown?
When you, I'm not sure I understood about the bad rep part.
Well, I mean, it's if you're telling a story that's not necessarily your own,
right.
And so then but you know that it's not been possible. For example, like if we look at Reconstruction and after, you know, post-Reconstruction, and we're looking at slavery and we're looking at sharecroppers and we're looking at the idea, because what's underlying this not, it's kind of an unspoken thing, but it is spoken at the same time as the underlying current of race. And so we're also looking at educational factors. We're looking at who is able to tell a story, who is allowed to even read or write to tell one. So how does that feel for you, being responsible in some ways for a history and a tradition that is not your own?
Right. Well, my background is more journalistic. You know, I was in journalism, not in folklore, actually, although there's a lot of crossover. So my idea was always to try to get as accurate a story as possible from the musicians, and you know, not to try to interpret it so much, but just to let them tell it, and then later, if I can add facts that I find from other sources, and you know, then we try to fill it out that way. But you know, we always have to realize that the stories that we get, the stories that we pass on, are filtered in some sense because it's coming from an African American community through a white writer or historian or professor. You know, so but you know, I think we're all conscious of trying to keep it as close to the source as we can.
David, did you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, I mean, as investigators or researchers, of course, we're the ones posing the questions, so we get answers to the questions that we want to know about, which are not necessarily, I mean, in some cases they are, but maybe not always, the things that various people in the community or older musicians might think are important. I mean, actually, of course, in thinking about the past, most musicians or anyone that was around the music hasn't thought about it in a kind of structured way, the way historians or ethnomusicologists might think about it, but they do think about it. I guess the trick is to try to get people just talking. You ask a question, then if they lead off in another direction, if it's, as long as it's relevant in some way to the music, and try to go with it, so you can get the answers to the questions that you want to know about, but also
answering them and telling that story.
Right. I think a lot of the early blues articles we read in magazines that came from England were so concerned with the records that everybody made, and then I think one of the things that we've learned from dealing with a lot of artists who came from communities where there were no records, there weren't any recording artists, and when you think about maybe Rube Lacey made one record, which is a great record, and for Paramount Records, this is one of the definitive records of Delta blues, but that was like one day of his life. You know, what about the rest of his life?
Right.
So even trying to, like David said, the rest, when you talk to artists, they may tell stories about the farm or the work or their family and stuff, and you know, I think I was probably guilty in the early years of kind of trying to bypass that and get to the music, but I really, you know, realized more and more that that's all part of it.
Yeah, we think of all the questions we should have asked and wish we'd asked.
Yeah, and we're learning a lot working on the Mississippi Blues Trail about places where nobody thought there was any blues. There's been blues in just about every town in Mississippi, and it's been this huge focus on the Delta and a little bit on the Jackson area, but you know, it came from all over, and the same with Arkansas and all around western Tennessee too.
John, did you want to elaborate on that?
I was just going to say, I mean, I think that part of the problem is, you know, getting back to the first point you're making with it, just the fact that blues and, you know, and other traditional African American forms are not properties, but find homes in academia is a bit strange, you know, and it's like just the fact that, you know, there's an institute from a record producer at Rhodes that's interested in studying this stuff and promoting it. You know, it's something that, yeah, I think is, you know, in jazz too, it's like, you know, when you're studying how to play jazz in school, it's so different than the way that the music actually evolved, you know, and it's something that you have to always keep in mind.
That's interesting, because when you take a music or, you know, a style, and you take that and you go somewhere else with it, well, you're one person, well, you meet another group of people. That group of people may have their own style, their way of playing there. So then there's already an evolution that happens when a group of bodies get together that's not the same.
Yeah, I would not want to see research and the kind of memorialization of the music smother the living tradition, but
right.
In a sense, some of that is almost inevitable. The past or the history of any type of popular music inevitably becomes something of a burden to that music, in the sense that it's all available. We can hear the music of 80 years ago, and we can hear the music of today, and we can enjoy it all. Somebody from a distance who has had very little contact with the music, like some folks from Italy, for example, that I met today. I mean, there are people from all over the world here, often come to this part of the country or to Chicago, expecting the blues and the blues scene to be like it was when Robert Johnson recorded. They expect to see sharecropper shacks lining the roads. They expect to see cotton in bloom 12 months of the year. They expect to hear the music as it was on those great records. And of course, I mean, there are people that can provide some of that. And in a way, museums and markers provide some of that. And those of us that perform historical styles, but we haven't lived those things. And I'm very thankful that I haven't. I don't have any desire to pick cotton, and I have great respect for those who did pick cotton. I mean, that was labor.
Yeah, speaking of what you just said, I brought a film crew from Germany to Helena one time to film the blues, and we had this great band. It was Lonnie Pitcher playing guitar, Frank Frost on harmonica, and Sam Carr on drums. That would be like an all-star Delta blues band to anyone's mind. But the German producer, after she heard it for a while, she looked at me and says, "This is not blues." You know, it's like rhythm and blues. She was expecting Robert Johnson or something.
Scottish.
Oh, I was just thinking, when you're talking about this issue of like the discourse or all the talking we do and how it affects things, I think one of the things is blues has been a lot more resistant, or at least it's been slow in terms of institutionalization. Jazz sort of followed the classical model, and it has for 50 years. I mean, if you look at the 1950s albums on Prestige or Riverside, there are dissertations on the back by people like Ivory and people like that. And I think nowadays, we've got somebody on stage who's evident of it. Aspiring jazz artists today, it's almost like you go to college to study jazz. Oftentimes, to be a legitimate jazz artist, it's part of it. I can't really imagine that. I think to a certain degree, blues is still very much in the commercial sphere, though. We sometimes get accused by blues artists of, well, you all in the blues world are controlling it. We're like, we're barely making a living doing it. How are we controlling anything? But it simply hasn't reached that stage where I think that it doesn't really have that important of a presence in the academy yet.